Like the title of the video says, we are going to be going over Cheryl's support in Evil Dead the game. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to talk a lot about what supports are and how support works, what its role is, all of its special features, all of its special stat lines, etc. If you want to jump to a specific section of the video, please reference the timestamps below. This is going to be a very long, very in-depth video with a lot of numbers. So if you want to jump to a specific section, if you just care about a build or opinions or whatever you're here for, you can use those timestamps to save you a bit of time. If you want to watch the whole thing, I obviously appreciate that too. So let's jump into supports before we talk about Cheryl specifically. There's a lot of specific things about supports and how they work that is going to be very important to understand. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that supports only do 80% damage. Now, all classes in the game have a damage modifier tied to their class based on ranged and melee weapons. Supports specifically have 80% on both, so their melee damage only does 80% of what you would think it would do based on the weapon, and that is the same for ranged. So in general, supports are going to have much lower DPS than other classes. This is true even if you spec into damage, because all numbers in this game that are buffs are almost all multipliers. So just keep that in mind, that even if you try to go DPS on a support, you're probably still going to end up with pretty bad numbers. From there, let's talk about inventory and items. So obviously one of the most important things for healers are shimps and amulets. Now, the specific thing that makes support special compared to all the other classes is that when they use a support item like a shimps or an amulet, it actually does its effects in an AoE around you. So before we get into the numbers of what shimps and what amulets do, let's talk about that area of effect. So all healers have an area of effect, but they're not created equally. Now, at least currently, as of the making of this video, Pablo and Support Ash have a healing radius of 5 meters. Cheryl has one of 10 meters. Now, a lot of people believe that this is a bug. Some people believe that Cheryl's bugged to have too high of a radius. Some people believe that Pablo and Support Ash is bugged to be too low. Whatever the case is, this obviously makes Cheryl a little bit stronger than the other supports, at least in that way right now. Now, I don't think Cheryl's the best support, but we'll talk about all that in the opinion section. But that radius increase on her healing capabilities is surely very nice. It can help you reach multiple targets if people are spread out. It can make plays, and it's also kind of nice not to have to ask your team to group every, 30 seconds or so. So it's a very nice feature. It isn't listed anywhere on Cheryl's abilities, so if you look through her skill set, this radius increase is not listed, and that's what makes most people think it's probably a bug one way or the other. So from there, let's talk about what a shimps actually does. So when you heal yourself with a shimps, no matter what character you are, no matter if you're a warrior or a support or a leader, you are going to heal for 50% of your maximum HP. That means if you're a support and you start with 900 HP, that's only going to be 450 healing. However, if you're a warrior, you start with 1300 HP. That means you're going to be getting 650 HP when you drink a shimps. Now, all of the things in the game that boost your health, this includes the pink F system where you can boost your health, and then also the node down here, if you look, it's called industrial strength to boost your health. You will always have 50% of your max health as healing. So if you take these nodes, it actually makes your shimps heal for a little bit more on yourself. Now, this number is not the same as your outgoing healing. The outgoing healing that you give is actually 360 health. So at base, supports will heal themselves if they have no HP upgrades for 450, and then the outgoing will be 360. This is about an 80% ratio. The important thing to note here is that your outgoing healing does not scale based on your maximum health. That 360 number is a flat amount, and it is only improved by two things in the entire game. The first one is accessible only to Cheryl, and it's her final passive called Contact Healing. The second one is available to all supports through Shimps Plus. We'll talk about this when we get to the perk section, and we'll talk about this when we get to Cheryl specifically, but just keep in mind that 360 number is pretty important to know when you're healing other people. One kind of caveat to that, and you'll kind of notice this the more you play, is that when you heal, you use your AoE heal to hit a hunter, they have much lower HP, so it's going to look like you're healing them for like 40%, maybe even 50% of their HP if you have like some perks going on. Whereas a warrior with a much larger health pool, it's going to look like a much smaller heal. So when a warrior drinks the shimps themselves, because it's 50%, they actually heal themselves much better than if you had healed them. Now in general, it's still a better idea for supports to use the support items, unless you're in a very dangerous situation. You have to drink an emergency shimps or something. But just keep all of that in mind. So the outgoing healing is a flat amount of 360, only improved by two things in the game. Amulets are a little bit different. Each shield bar in the game is worth 150 by default. So it's 150 HP. Now this might be smaller than some of you might be thinking, but it's still pretty good. The amount of outgoing healing is only worth 100. So it's about 67%. And if you remember the shimps ratio, by default it's about 80%. Now, just like the shimps don't get improved by a maximum HP increase, it is the same for shields. So there are nodes that can increase the length of your shield bar, but that really just increases the amount of amulet shielding you give yourself. It does not improve the amount of outgoing shielding that you give. The important kind of break point with that is the fact that because each shield bar is 150 HP and the amount of outgoing healing is 100, that means if you pop 3 amulets on yourself, you will have 3 shield bars, and your team will have exactly 2 shield bars. So that's kind of an important number and kind of an important breakpoint to understand when we're going to talk about perks a little bit later. The other thing that has to do with inventory is the fact that supports actually have a different amount that they can carry for support items, and that they actually start with some as well. So while most characters start with 0 support items, that means shimps and amulets, and they can only carry 3 of each, supports can carry 4 at maximum, and they actually start the game with 1 of each. Now, each character can also have perks that make them start the game with different amounts, or maybe have different maximum amounts, but by default, supports can carry 4 of the support items, and they start with 1. So that's kind of an important distinction. So I think that mostly covers it for supports. They have lower health pools, they can heal in an AoE, they have an aura, it's not really an aura, but a radius that they can heal. Cheryl's is much bigger than the other twos at 10 meters instead of 5 meters. So that kind of covers the general support information. Let's go ahead and jump into Cheryl specifically. So here we have Healing Touch. This heals for 60 health every second for 6 seconds. If you multiply that out, it equals 360. And if you remember our shimps healing, the outgoing healing is 360. I don't think this is an accident. Healing Touch is basically an AoE version of your shimps. It's on a 2-minute cooldown, which is a very long cooldown. Some things to note about Healing Touch: it seems very good, obviously. However, just keep in mind you're not going to have 100% uptime on this ability. Very often at the beginning of the game, there's not a lot of damage going on until the demon finds you or you get on objectives. So Healing Touch isn't going to get a whole lot of value early on unless you get found by the demon. Once you get found and once you're doing objectives, Healing Touch is going to have a much higher uptime, but just keep in mind there's going to be a big section of the game, probably at minimum 2 minutes, sometimes even up to like 7-8 minutes of the game, which can be like half the game, where you're just not really using Healing Touch that much. Some other things to note about Healing Touch is the fact that when you use this, the animation actually bends over. You bend down really low. Now you can take damage during this ability. This ability can be interrupted, but it's very difficult for the demon to time it. But it can be interrupted. Now, not everything will interrupt it. You are CC immune to most things. And in addition, because your animation goes so low, some attacks based on which demon you're facing actually will just miss you. So in certain circumstances, you can actually use this as kind of like a dodge. The other weird thing to note about Healing Touch is that while most things in the game, like shimps and amulets and certain other people's abilities, can affect your team when they're in a vehicle, Healing Touch cannot. So Healing Touch does not heal your allies if they're in a car. So just make sure if you use this right when you get out of a car, make sure the other team the other members of your team get out as well before you pop it, otherwise you're going to waste some healing. Moving on to Cola Coaster. You carry more shimps and you start the match with an extra one in your inventory. Now, the extra one in your inventory, all supports get one at the start, so Cheryl actually starts with 2, and she can carry more. Now, it doesn't say how many more, but that number is 2. So you actually go from the default amount of 4 for a support on chimps to 6. So this is pretty nice. It's a pretty decent jump, but you also have to remember that your team is carrying shimps for you. And in general, if your team is good, they should be dropping those shimps for you to use, not for them to use. So don't think of this as the ability to take Cheryl from, you know, having 2 more shimps. It's the team to have 2 more shimps, and the team can carry a lot more shimps than just you can. So the difference between a maximum amount of shimps isn't Cheryl having 6 versus 8, because you can actually get a few more with perks. So Cheryl can actually carry 8 at her maximum amount. So it's not the difference between her carrying 6 and 8, it's the difference between your team carrying 15 shimps versus 17 shimps. So if you think about it from that perspective, it's not quite as big of a deal, but it is very, very nice in pugs when they won't drop their shimps. You're going to be able to grab a few more in the early stages to have for later when your team is, you know, being dumb. So moving on, we have Contact Courage. Drinking a shimps will partially reduce the fear of you and your teammates. So this is basically if someone gets affected by your shimps, they will have fear reduction of 25. Now the entire bar is 100, so think of this as 25% fear reduction when you drink a shimps. Now in general, you shouldn't drink a shimps just to reduce fear, but there are a couple situations where that could be a very, very powerful thing. Hunters are very dangerous when they are possessed. So if your hunter is about to get possessed and you don't think they're very good, or they're maybe too busy to notice their fear, or it got bursted very quickly, they might just jump over into fear before they can drop their weapon. If you think this is about to happen, or you see it happening, you may want to drink a shimps just to bring them back underneath that line and to prepare for them being possessed. Now, the other situation is that in the early game, you can be detected if your fear is high enough. The enemy demon can just see you no matter where you are in the map if you have high fear. Sometimes, if you haven't been found yet and you're not particularly looted, if you don't think someone can make it to a fire, you may want to drink a shimps to make sure they get there. Now, this isn't always going to be important. You're not always going to do this, but it is an option for you to be able to do. Down here we have Contact Healing. When you drink a shimps, nearby teammates also gain 100 health. Now this is a very decent upgrade. It's 100 extra health. That's about 30% extra health, which is something that's unique to her. She can actually burst heal with shimps a little bit harder. Another thing to note though is just kind of like your Q ability, you're not always going to get 100% value out of this. If you're drinking a shimps to kind of top everyone off, you're probably going to be losing some HP. If you're drinking a shimps to heal one specific person that's low HP and everybody else kind of has high HP, this extra 100 healing isn't going to get value. So I hope that makes sense. You're not always going to get full value out of a lot of Cheryl's perks, but they are all very solid in their own right. So I think that covers the Cheryl specific section. Let's go ahead and jump into perks. Now, perks are the same for all characters within a class. So that means Support, Ash, and Pablo have the exact same perks as Cheryl. That does not mean that they will necessarily have the same builds. So what I'm going to do first is I'm actually going to go through all the perks and explain kind of what I think about them, why they're good, why they're bad, and then after that, I'll kind of go into the builds that I think you can kind of go on a character. Or on a support, I should say, and specifically the ones that I think are good on Cheryl. So let's go ahead and start talking about this. So we have Shimps Plus. Basically, it makes your Shimps restore more health in the amount of 10, 15, 20, 30%. Now, you have to put 1 point in here. Every support has to put at least 1 point into this node to travel to their other nodes. This is obvious. So when you're comparing the value of Shimps Plus, you shouldn't compare it to 0% versus 30%. You should always compare it 10% versus 30% if you're trying to figure out if you want to put all your points here. Now, that being said, what are the numbers? How much extra healing do you get? Well, you remember I said contact healing was about 30%, and that's true. Shims Plus is going to make you heal for about 108 more. So contact healing and Shims Plus do stack. So it'll basically take you from doing 360 healing on Cheryl. You'll get 460 with contact healing, and then you're going to go up to 560 if you max out Shims Plus. Now, if you don't max out Shims Plus, you are losing about 20%. So you're going to go from about 560 to more around like 500, maybe a little bit less. So just keep that in mind. It's not super mandatory to go Shims Plus, but I think on Cheryl, who is so focused on Shims, I think this is actually a pretty decent pickup. The next node that we're going to talk about is Artful Dodger. Reduces the stamina cost of dodging. Now, on supports specifically, and on leaders actually as well, they have the same stamina profile. It will actually give you the ability to dodge 3 times versus 2 times if you have upgraded your pink F stamina all the way. Now, this is super important for a support. I think Artful Dodger is a mandatory point for most classes, but on a support especially, because you are going to be focused very hard. Supports are the weakest class in the game to being focused. They don't have the damage that all the other classes have, and they don't have the amount of dodges that a hunter has or the defense that a warrior has. So just keep in mind, as the support, you are going to be priority target number 1 almost always, and having an extra dodge is super important. Also, there's an important thing to note. If you have 3 dodges, that is actually more effective than you might think. Enemy combos in the game, at least by default without canceling and stuff, but enemy combos, when they do their melee attacks, are always in chains of 4. This is true for the demon, and this is also true for the survivors. Now, there are ways around that for the demon if they're good and they know how to, but in general they should only be able to do 4 attacks in a row. Now, if you only have 2 dodges, that means you're going to get hit twice if they're close enough. Now, if you get a 3rd dodge, that means you're only going to get hit once. Now, taking 2 damage versus 1 damage is a 50% damage reduction. So that extra dodge is super important. I think this point is always mandatory on most classes. Next up, we're going to talk about kind of a trap. I think the damage nodes and the offensive nodes as a support are kind of a trap. Now, some of them you could definitely make an argument for. Something like balance bar damage on melee attacks can be super impactful on a support, but just keep in mind that the straight damage nodes are not good. The melee weapon damage and the range weapon damage are just point sinks, and they're not going to be worth the other things that you can get. That being said, one of the best nodes that you can take is Tougher Than Hell. This reduces the amount of damage you receive by 10% if you max it out. This is good, obviously, on everyone. This is a super strong node. The only problem with it on supports is that you have to travel through 2 nodes to get to it, and these nodes are not supporting your team really in any way. Another kind of weird thing about these nodes is that if you actually look at the lines themselves, this is a melee node, and then this is a range node. This is a range node, then this is a melee node. It's a little weird that they don't even have like unified rows here. It actually makes you go through one of each. It's just a small optimization problem, I think. But in the end, to be honest, these 2 are much stronger than these 2. So if you do want to get Tougher Than Hell, I would personally recommend always going through the top and maybe even seeing stars maxed out, because this is going to let you finish your spam a little bit better. So that kind of covers it for this section. Down here we have long life batteries. This increases your flashlight duration. Not super important. Here we have Fear No Evil. Supports, fear isn't as important, but I think fear is always very important. Possession is one of the most dangerous tools that a demon can have, and even supports can cause a lot of mayhem if you have a decent ranged weapon. So I think Fear No Evil is definitely a contender for one of the better nodes that you can get. Arcane Knowledge is the range that you can detect map items. It says objective items, but what it means is map items. This isn't super important when you learn where all of the maps can spawn, but it is still somewhat nice on the bigger map, especially like in Bullard Swamp and Misty Groves and stuff, where it can kind of take you a second. Over here we have fast forward. This is again one of the better nodes, one of the best nodes a support can get. It makes the objective events, and I know both of these say objective, but this one is objective events for like the dagger and the pages, take 10% less long. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot, but in the end, if it actually reduces the enemy from having another damage rotation, another spawn rotation, another boss rotation, you're trimming off about 20 seconds ish when you take this, and that can really make a difference and stabilize the team. I think fast forward's a really great node. Not mandatory, but really, really good. Next up, we have Deep Pockets Amulets, and we're going to actually talk about Deep Pockets Shimp's Cola as well when we do this. But increases the total amulets that you can carry. So supports can carry 4. This would take us up to 6. Now, if you remember, I said when you pop 3 amulets, that takes your team to 2 bars, 2 shield bars. Most characters can only have 4 shield bars total. So that means if you have Deep Pockets, you can carry 6 amulets, which means at the end game, you can actually have personally 6 to just pop on yourself in a row and give your entire team full shield bars. This can be super impactful at the end game if you want to hoard amulets. In addition, we have Shimp's Cola Deep Pockets. This obviously does the same thing, but for Shimps. This is really good. I think it's very, very well worth the points. It's not always going to matter. You're not always going to be at max Shimps, but it's a nice thing to not leave Shimps behind. Jumping back up, we're going to talk about Reinforced Amulet. Now, incoming damage is reduced when you have a shield active. Now, in my opinion, this node is really only good on Pablo for supports. It's also good on AOD Ashe, but for supports, it's really only good on Pablo. The other two more focus on health healing, so they don't actually want to have shields up all the time. So Reinforced Amulet's kind of a pass on Cheryl, and then Improved Amulet is a very selfish node, and it's not even that strong, so I think it's a pass on all supports. Maybe all characters, really. Down here we have First Aid. When you revive a teammate from bleeding out, they recover a percentage of their health. This is okay to put 1 point in because we kind of have to travel through to get some of these other good nodes. But in general, the revival nodes, which are here, here, and here, are just not very good. They're decent percentages, they're decent amounts and stuff, but there's way more important things to get than revival stuff. Generally, if you're reviving people, you're trying to stabilize, and these can be kind of good, but I think it would be much better to just take something good and never go down. This is kind of a get good argument, but I think it's very valid in this case. So let's go ahead and talk about Packing Pop. This is you start the match with 2 extra Shimps. This is always very, very good. This can really help you if the demon finds you quickly and you haven't had time to loot. You're still going to have a lot of staying power with Packing Pop. So I highly recommend this on pretty much every support. Same with Deep Pockets, Amulets, and Shimps. Out of these 3, Deep Pocket Amulets is probably the least important, but these 2 are extremely important. Finally, we have Industrial Strength. This increases your maximum health pool. I think this is super, super important on a support because you're going to get focused, and this can make it to where the enemy needs 1 additional hit, or maybe needed to use a heavy or something else to actually get you down that last little bit. So I think Industrial Strength should be probably maxed on every single support. It's very, very, very good. But, you know, you guys come up with your own builds, obviously. The last nodes in the tree are absolutely just some of the worst nodes. Never take these, but we have Deep Pocket Matchsticks. Garbage. Do not take this. This is one of the worst. And then Speed of Light. This is right behind it. It's just, they're just not good. They're never going to be useful. Please do not waste points on these. So we've kind of talked about the perks. Let's talk about builds. So the way I look at the character is you kind of have to have your core, and then you need to decide where you're going to go from there. So I think with Cheryl, you're probably going to want to put points into Shimps Plus. I think you're probably going to want all of these points. Obviously, these points right here are very, very good for Cheryl because she focuses on Shimps. And then the health node is obviously very good as well. Deep Pocket Amulets, you could probably make an argument for not needing it or not wanting it. I personally like the utility that it brings. But from here, I would probably put some points into Fear Resistance right here. I really like the Fear Resistance. I think it's a good node. Um, this is what I would consider is Cheryl's core. Now from here, you can basically take two paths. You can either go into fast forward. This would basically look like this. And then you put one extra point into arcane knowledge just as a dump point. Arcane knowledge isn't super impactful, especially when you know where the map pieces are, but I think this is the fast forward build. Or you can kind of do this up here and get tougher than hell. This is a much more defensive way of building her, and I think that can be really, really good. The final option, and there is kind of a slightly different variation here, is that if we go here and we actually pull these points out, you can actually pull amulets out and get fast forward as well. So this has the benefit of giving you fast forward, which is very good for the team, and giving you some defense for yourself. Now, what are the weaknesses of this? First of all, you don't get as much fear reduction, which can make a difference in some games. It can absolutely make a difference. I know a lot of people don't think fear is important, but I think it really, really is. Possession is a dangerous tool that the demon has. So losing these points can be pretty bad, and then losing the deep pocket amulets can be pretty bad as well. So moving on from there, let's talk about outfits. And I know this is a weird topic, but essentially the demon sees your outline. That means if you have a dress, you are very easy to detect. If you go with this, you look a lot more like other characters, and it's not as bad. So if you really want to try hard, you're going to want to go with this. Finally, let's talk about my opinions. So my opinions on the character is that she's very solid. A lot of her abilities don't get 100% uptime. Sometimes you waste things, sometimes you don't get enough. None of these are really super 100% always amazing, but they're always decent. I think Cheryl isn't the best support, but I don't think she's a bad character at all. I think currently, just the fact that she has an increased area of effect on her healing probably brings her up into line with the other characters, the other support characters. I think if she didn't have that radius, she would actually probably be the worst support, because that's like the big thing that she has right now. That's like, in my opinion, the most important thing that she has. But if you guys disagree, that's obviously completely okay. Let me know in the comment section below. This video is long enough already. I'll see you guys later.